The paper coffee cup slipped from Marcus Whitfield's hands and splashed across the marble lobby floor, but he barely noticed. He was too busy holding the cardboard box against his chest, the one they had given him 10 minutes ago to clear out his desk. Inside it sat 3 things. A chipped mug his son had painted in the 2nd grade, a tiny cactus in a plastic pot, the only green thing that had ever survived on his gray little cubicle, and a leather journal, soft at the corners, filled with pages nobody in that building had ever bothered to open. Behind the glass walls, people had gathered to watch. They whispered to each other the way people do when they believe they are watching someone fall. Nobody saw the wetness in his eyes. Nobody looked closely enough to notice the small boy grinning up from the photo tucked into the journal's front pocket. And not a single soul in that towering office knew that the quiet, soft-spoken father they had just thrown out onto the street was one of the richest men the city had ever produced. If you believe that a person's worth was never printed on their paycheck, and that kindness outlasts every title we chase, please like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe for more stories that stay with the heart. Marcus had never wanted the cars or the corner suites or the tailored suits that cost more than most people earned in a season. Years earlier, in a rented garage with a leaking roof, he and his closest friend had built a small software idea into something the whole world eventually depended on. The money that followed was more than either of them could have imagined. But then came the year that broke him. His wife, Naomi, grew sick in the spring and was gone by the following winter, and she left behind a newborn boy named Eli and a silence in the house that no amount of money could fill. After that, the wealth felt like weight. The board wanted him back at the head of the table. The reporters wanted a photograph. Marcus wanted neither. He handed the company to people he trusted, packed one suitcase, and walked away from the life that had made him famous. He let his beard grow. He traded the penthouse for a modest 2-bedroom on a quiet street. He took an ordinary job at an ordinary firm, sorting accounts in a cubicle under fluorescent light, because he wanted to remember what it felt like to be nobody in particular. More than that, he wanted his son to grow up gentle, to grow up humble, to grow up believing that people mattered more than money. Every morning, he made Eli scrambled eggs and cut the toast into triangles the way the boy liked. Every morning he attempted, badly, to comb the child's hair into something presentable. Then he walked him to school and went to work, where his co-workers knew him only as the man who kept to himself and left at 5 o'clock on the dot. Some of them laughed at the dented sedan he parked out back. Some of them felt sorry for the tired single father. He never once corrected them. Remember that journal. It matters later. Then a new regional director arrived, a man named Grant Foster, who wore ambition like cologne and believed that softness was a kind of failure. Something about Marcus rubbed him the wrong way from the first handshake. The quietness, the calm, the way the man never fought for credit or clawed for attention. To Grant, that stillness looked like weakness, and weakness was something he had built his career on stamping out. One gray afternoon, the school called. Eli had spiked a fever and could not stop shivering in the nurse's office. Marcus was up and out of his chair before he had even set the phone down, grabbing his coat, rushing for the door. Grant watched him hurry out 2 hours early, and Grant drew the only conclusion a man like Grant ever draws. He decided Marcus was lazy. He decided Marcus did not care. The next morning, in front of the entire floor, Grant made an example of him. He said Marcus lacked commitment. He said Marcus was dead weight the company could no longer afford to carry. Marcus tried to explain about his son, about the fever, but the words landed on a man who had already stopped listening. Around the room, people studied their shoes. A few opened their mouths and then closed them again. Nobody stood up. Nobody said a word in his defense. And then Grant slid a folded letter across the table. And just like that, 5 years of quiet work ended in a single sentence. Marcus did not shout. He packed his box. He thanked the people at the desks near his, one by one, for the years they had shared, and he carried his belongings toward the elevator looking not angry, but simply tired, the way a person looks when they have run out of surprise at how the world treats them. Outside, he sat on a low stone bench near the entrance and pulled the photograph from the journal. Eli at 4, gap-toothed and laughing. Naomi in the background, caught mid-smile, forever young now. He remembered the promise he had made at her bedside, that he would stay strong, that he would give their boy a good and gentle life. He drew a slow breath and let a sad smile cross his face. That is when a long black car pulled to the curb. A man climbed out fast, straightening his coat, scanning the sidewalk with something close to panic in his eyes. It was Harold Reyes, the chairman of the very company Marcus had founded in that leaking garage all those years ago. For 3 long years, Harold had been searching for the man who vanished. He had finally traced him here. He had come in person, hat in hand, to beg him to return. But the moment his eyes landed on Marcus sitting alone on a bench with a cardboard box on his knees, the color drained from Harold's face. He understood at once exactly what had just happened inside that building. At the very same moment, the chief executive of the firm that had just fired Marcus, a sharp and capable woman named Diane Alcott, arrived for a surprise walkthrough of the floor. She felt the strange tension the second she stepped off the elevator. An assistant murmured that someone had just been let go that morning. Another whispered that a fleet of expensive cars had appeared at the front entrance. Curious, Diane crossed to the tall glass doors and looked down at the street. What she saw stopped her cold. A cluster of powerful men in dark suits stood gathered on the sidewalk, and every one of them was arranged in a careful half-circle around the tired man with the cardboard box. Standing closest, leaning in with visible worry, was a face Diane recognized from the covers of magazines. It could not be. She was down the stairs and out the front doors before she could think it through. And that was when she heard Harold Reyes speak, and heard the word he used. He called Marcus, sir. For a moment, nobody moved. Diane stood frozen on the steps, staring at a scene that made no sense. The invisible single father, the man they had all walked past 1,000 times without a nod, was being treated like royalty by one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Who fired him? The question carried across the entrance and hung there in the cold air. Employees crowded behind the glass, suddenly afraid. Grant Foster went white to the lips. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. And then, slowly, every head in that lobby turned toward Grant, and one trembling hand rose to point at him. Diane turned back to Marcus. Her eyes fell on the box in his lap, on the small painted mug, on the photograph of the little boy and the smiling woman. And in an instant, the whole thing rearranged itself in her mind. This man had never been lazy. He had never been dead weight. He had been a father, doing everything he could, carrying a grief none of them had ever thought to ask about. Then Harold said the words out loud, quietly, for everyone to hear. Marcus Whitfield was not simply wealthy. He was the founder of one of the largest technology empires on Earth, and his personal fortune ran past $9 billion. The gasp moved through the crowd like a wave. Somebody dropped a phone. Somebody else pressed both hands to her mouth. Grant Foster swayed on his feet as though the floor had tilted beneath him. But Marcus did not gloat. He did not rise up in triumph. There was no anger anywhere on his face, only a deep and quiet sadness. Diane felt shame crawl up the back of her neck. How many mornings had she brushed past this man in the hallway without so much as a hello? How much had this company overlooked, judging a good soul by his old car and his quiet voice and his triangle-cut toast crumbs? Marcus stood. He looked up at the tall glass building one last time. And then he said something that silenced everyone on that sidewalk. He told them that all the money in the world had never once made him happy. The happiest hours of his life, he said, were the ordinary ones. Making breakfast for a small boy, reading the same bedtime story for the 90th night in a row, hearing his son laugh through a bedroom door. He said people love to judge one another without ever knowing what the other person is carrying. Some are drowning in grief. Some are raising children with no one to help them. Some are hiding a pain that never shows on the surface. Every one of them, he said, deserves a little kindness. Tears stood in more than one pair of eyes now. Even Diane had to look away. And then Grant Foster, the man who had humiliated him, sank down onto the cold pavement and begged to be forgiven. He confessed that he had judged Marcus for looking ordinary. He had believed, all his life, that real power wore expensive clothes and demanded to be seen. Marcus looked down at him for a long moment. Then he reached out a hand and helped the man back to his feet. He said that forgiveness was lighter to carry than hatred, because hatred only ever multiplied the hurt. Grant broke down completely, and for the first time in more years than he could remember, he understood how hard his own heart had become. Before we go on, we want to stop here for a moment, because the part of this story you can see, the reversal on the sidewalk, is not really the heart of it. What made Marcus who he was came from somewhere quieter, from people whose names the crowd would never learn. There was a nurse at the hospital, years before, who had sat with him through the last night of Naomi's life and never once looked at her watch. There was an old neighbor named Ruth who had left casseroles on his porch every Sunday for a year after the funeral, never knocking, never expecting thanks, just leaving them warm on the step. And there was a librarian at the little branch down the street who had let a grieving man and his sleepy son stay long past closing on winter afternoons, because she could see they had nowhere warmer to be. None of those three people stood on that sidewalk. All three of them did. Because this is what we believe, that every small, unseen act of decency travels much farther than the person who gave it will ever know. Ruth's Sunday casseroles, the nurse's steady hand, the librarian's unlocked door. All of it had traveled with Marcus, all the way to that curb. A few days later, Marcus made a choice that surprised everyone who knew the story. He did not take his revenge. Instead, he bought the struggling company outright, the very one that had thrown him out. And he did not fire a single person. He built programs for parents raising children alone. He offered flexible hours to anyone caring for someone sick. He set up scholarships for the children of everyone who worked there. Slowly, the whole place changed. Managers grew patient. Co-workers grew kind. For the first time in memory, the office felt less like a machine and more like a family. Months later, Marcus came to the company's winter gathering, and little Eli came with him, dressed in a small navy suit and holding his father's hand with enormous pride. When Marcus walked in, the room rose to its feet. Many of the people applauding had become his genuine friends. Grant Foster was there too, and Grant now spent his weekends leading a charity that helped struggling families keep their homes. He told anyone who would listen that meeting Marcus had turned his whole life around. As the evening wound down, Eli tugged his father toward the tall, dark windows and pressed close to his side. In a small voice, the boy whispered that he thought Mommy would have been proud of him. Marcus looked out at the night sky above the city and felt the tears come at last. For 3 long years, he had believed the hole Naomi left behind could never be filled. But standing there, holding his son's hand in a room full of people learning to be gentler, he understood something he had not understood before. Grief can break a person into pieces, but kindness, given and received, can slowly gather those pieces back together. Never measure a person's worth by the car they drive or the clothes they wear. Never mistake a quiet voice for an empty life or worn shoes for a small one. Never assume the tired stranger carrying a cardboard box has nothing left to give the world. Because sometimes that stranger is not a failure at all. Sometimes he is a devoted father. Sometimes he is a broken heart still learning to beat. And sometimes he is a billionaire who only ever wanted to be treated like a human being. Before we finish, tell us down in the comments. If you had been standing in that lobby, would you have chosen revenge or would you have chosen forgiveness? And if this story touched something in you, please like it, comment, and share it with someone who needs the reminder today. Subscribe so that more people can find stories like this one. Stories that ask us never to judge a soul by the surface, because the quiet man with the cardboard box is so often carrying far more than we could ever guess.